Time magazine has called him one of the greatest thinkers and scientists of the 20th century. The renowned Harvard scientist Steven Pinker has gone further and said that he's one of the great thinkers in Western thought. Robert Trivers, world-renowned evolutionary biologist, is my guest on Profile. Welcome. I'm Ian Boyne. Wildlife, Adventures of an Evolutionary Biologist is the latest book by Professor Robert Trivers, former Harvard professor at Rutgers University, a most controversial man, some would say a mercurial man, and an irascible man who will walk off my set if I don't finish at the time that he has imposed on me. Psychology Today magazine, in its February 2016 edition, has a long article on him, Portrait of a Renegade Genius. He was doing calculus from he was young, was a math genius. And then he turned to science. He's known as the Lizard Man. He's been living in Jamaica on and off for a number of years. A remarkable individual who joined the Black Panther Party, worked with Huey Newton in the 1960s, had been arrested in Jamaica several times. When an intruder came in the house and thought that he would be having an easy time with this white guy, he was stoutly resisted. Robert Trivers, good to have you on Profile. And it's important to note that he's the winner of the Crawford Prize, which is regarded as the Nobel Prize for his field. He's one of the most distinguished persons to have appeared on Profile for the last 29 years. That's why I put up with so much foolishness from you. It's a good thing I know that this kind of resistance is what you give to people all over the world. So
only when they act like you.
don't bother to knock me on my own show. It's great to
I
have
won't
you.
elaborate. No.
You suffered a nervous breakdown. You have bipolar depression. You have achieved all you have despite your bipolar depression. But while you were studying at Harvard, you had to check yourself into a hospital for about 11 weeks. Let's talk about that experience.
Well, I'm bipolar. I would leave the depression out because the bipolar is you go high and then you collapse with a breakdown and then you go low and you're depressed and you have to recover. The difference between bipolar and, say, unipolar, which are people that are perpetually depressed, or schizophrenia, which is a degenerative condition where you have to be on heavy meds your entire life, is that in bipolar, when you're high and low, you're not normal, and when you have a breakdown, you may be stone crazy, but when you recover, you're right back to where you were before. It's not as if you cannot resume doing scientific work at the level you were doing just before the breakdown. I'll tell you, the last breakdown I had was 16 years ago, and partly to be a good boy in the eyes of Rutgers University, I took a little anti-drug course that was taught in downtown New Brunswick, not by Rutgers.
Yes.
My problem was marijuana, which is trivial compared to the drug problems of the people that showed up at Narcotics Anonymous. Crackheads would get up and so on. And they would get up and say, "Hi, Joe, I'm Joe. I've been off crack for 4 months." And we'd all say, "God bless you, Joe." And I felt so compassionate for them because I knew that these poor men, there was nothing at the end of the recovery other than the temptation always to go back.
Yes.
It was not as if they could say, all right, I put crack aside, now I'll go back to doing my science. They had no other life. They had no other career. Yes. So my bipolarity is not as severe as it sounds. But I did, junior year at Harvard, have a mental breakdown. And the symptom in the high stage is you're getting less and less sleep. And generally, if it's less than 5, you should be seeing a doctor. If it's less than 3 per night, you should be checking into the nearest hospital. I wasn't sleeping at all for the last month. I was even trying to hypnotize myself into falling asleep. And I will say that when my friends brought me into the Harvard infirmary and the doctors said, who are you? I said, a newborn baby. And they said, not quite, try again. So they said, what are you? I said, a pregnant woman. They said, well, that isn't it either. Yes. But I never said a thoroughly confused Harvard sophomore, which would have been far closer to the truth. So that's how crazy I was. I didn't even know that I was a 21-year-old man.
And those answers were not just mock answers. You didn't know.
Oh no, I wasn't funning anybody. This was these were serious attempts.
Totally, yes.
And there was a police officer outside my hospital room the first 2 nights to make sure that I didn't misbehave, if you will.
Hurt anybody. Yeah. But you have had a bad temper through the years. You're in and out of fights with different people, literal and otherwise. You had a big bust up I read about in the press with Rutgers University. We won't go into there. That's why Psychology Today describes you as a renegade genius. This anger, do you see it as a problem?
Well, it has been a problem.
It has been a problem.
Sure. And yes.
Have you been trying to learn emotional mastery tools?
I spend a little bit more time now than I used to trying to meditate in a positive way which could help ameliorate the anger. That there's deep anger in me, there's no question. I used to say that my parents owed me the first mental breakdown. The successive ones were my own production.
You take responsibility.
And I had a deep anger towards my father because of a way that he used to humiliate me as a youngster in front of the rest of the siblings. And he had the strange trait that he disliked most the child that resembled him most. So since he was a PhD from Harvard in philosophy and I was the brightest of his sons, he was hardest on me. It turns out of his 3 daughters, he was hardest on the one I later learned who was the most brilliant of the 3 girls. She was so smart that this was back in the late 50s. I didn't write down phone numbers. I would just call over to Millie and say, her name is Susie, her number is 386-4413. And then I would say a month later, what's Susie's number? And she would say 384-1163. Literally, one trial learning. Never wrote a thing down, and so I never had to have a notebook because I had Millie. So you have genius
in your family, Robert?
A few of them, yes.
Yeah.
Very
Tell us
bright.
about your experience with calculus and how you had mastered that in a
Well, I was bored. As I mentioned to you earlier when we were talking, the only book I read seriously was the Bible, and then only the New Testament and Ecclesiastes and some Psalms.
Wisdom literature, yes.
Right. But when I was 12, I got interested in astronomy, but they didn't teach astronomy in school. And then my father had gotten a master's in mathematics from Harvard because in those days, if you got a PhD in one field, you had to have a master's in a related one. So he had all these math books. So I just remember I was 13 years old and I pulled out a math book called Differential Calculus. And I said, what the hell? You know, it's boring. These are the 50s. We weren't even allowed television. There was no such thing as the internet or whatnot. So you know, 2 months later, I had mastered differential calculus. So then I noticed the book next to it was called Integral Calculus. So I said, what the hell? So 2 months later, I knew all of calculus. And I taught it to myself. So yes, I had a talent, but the talent, it was nothing super genius or brilliant or anything like that. It was just an ability to focus intensely and follow a logical argument. And if you didn't follow it, go back to where you had made your mistake and do it over till you got it right. So it was more concentration, intense concentration.
We're interviewing the wildlife man, Robert Trivers. The world's most famous atheist is Richard Dawkins. Well, when Richard Dawkins wrote his very first book, The Selfish Gene, it was Robert Trivers who had done the foreword. And Richard Dawkins commends this book. One of the world's most renowned evolutionary biologists, Professor Robert Trivers, on Profile. My guest is the world-renowned evolutionary biologist and sociobiologist, Professor Robert Trivers, who is profiled in the February 2016 issue of Psychology Today, Portrait of a Renegade Genius. It says of Trivers, as a young man in the 1970s, Trivers gave biology a jolt, hatching idea after idea that illuminated how evolution shaped the behavior of all species, including fidelity, romantic bonds, and willingness to cooperate among humans. Today, at 72, he continues to spawn ideas. And if awards were given for such things, he certainly would be on the short list for America's most colorful academic, a genius, Robert Trivers. And you are a man who is not reluctant to acknowledge your genius. You know you're a brilliant man.
I'm bright enough, and I work hard. I have tended to avoid the term genius for two reasons. It can be a manipulative term that people use to manipulate you. You're a genius, so go ahead and geniusify. Or if you're a genius, things are real easy. You just click on, and there it goes. Also, more personally, walking around saying I'm a genius is not a helpful thing to be saying to yourself. You know, I'm a hard worker, and with a little bit of luck.
And you are talented. You have strong intellectual talents.
Yes, I have talents. There's no question about them. And the key is, do I use them in a fruitful way? And I was blessed when I discovered biology. It was like an illumination to me because I never had any biology. And I was 22, and then I suddenly learned, wow, the theory behind biology was so simple you could put it in a sentence. In every species, some individuals leave many surviving offspring, some leave few, and some leave none. And by logic, those that leave many offspring leave more genes behind. So therefore, over time, this process, which was then called natural selection, would result in genes that helped an individual to survive and reproduce. And that applies to all species. It applies to viruses. It applies to bacteria.
From the simplest to the most complex.
Yes. And that means also that biology is a unified discipline with a single logic. And it means one of the joys of being a biologist now for me is the field is expanding, and I'm interested in every part of it. If I sit down and talk with a virologist, and I know very little about viruses, I'm fascinated because there are single-strand, and we have a double-strand DNA, but there are single-strand viruses. There are DNA viruses. There are RNA viruses. So there's a whole world that has evolved, again, through the process of natural selection in the viral world, and understanding it is intrinsically fun.
And you are said to have solved one of the puzzles in evolutionary theory. And the puzzle as to why would any species sacrifice itself for genes. And you have worked on this concept of reciprocal altruism, and which essentially shows that we have an interest in cooperation. We have an interest in preserving our species and in preserving our genes.
Yes, the only the important little thing that one has to add when one talks about reciprocity is that there's a time lag. So I do something nice for you,
Yes.
and you do something nice back. But do you do it back? So there's a problem of the non-reciprocator. How do you handle him or her? Then, more important, is the subtle cheater. So you and I have a relationship and a friendship, but you're always shortcutting me. I do more for you than you do for me. So both of us benefit if the benefits are larger than the cost, but you're benefiting more and I'm benefiting less. So a sense of justice, in my opinion, evolves from reciprocity. It does not evolve from kinship. So a sense of fairness evolves as a way of evaluating whether our relationship is really balanced in the way we want to propagate our own genes.
Yeah. Can we derive morality from biology? It's a philosophical question. I mean,
Well, yes,
we
aspects
can,
of it, certainly.
but we can't use nature as a standard because we see so much violence in nature.
Well, you don't turn to nature and say, whoa, anything nature does is fine with me.
Precisely.
But the logic that evolved all of these traits certainly evolved a sense of morality. And I've given one subset, which is a sense of fairness or justice. But there are other senses of morality or immorality. Now, let me give you one I've been working on lately, which is dreadful. And they're called honor killings.
Honor killings.
Yes, and fortunately we don't have them in Jamaica. We've got dreadful problems in Jamaica, but honor killings are not one of them. And honor killings are where you kill your own grown daughter or son sometimes, although there's a bias towards daughters, because she has dishonored the family.
Yes, yes.
And their own parents will do it.
That's right.
And there's gruesome case after gruesome case. All right. I've been thinking about it and working with a brilliant Harvard geneticist who has my old job. And we see a very simple solution, which is ironic. And that is these honor killings always occur, or almost always occur, in societies that favor first cousin marriages. The children don't necessarily want to marry their first cousin, but the parents do. Now, if that were to continue regularly, the effect is to raise degrees of relatedness to 1. So in a normal outbred society, like, say, Jamaica, you're related to your child by a half. You're only related to him by more than a half if you're practicing some inbreeding. But if you're in a society in which cousin marriages are regular, that is driving degrees of relatedness up.
Well, the Christian fundamentals will be happy for that because the Christian scriptures forbid those kinds of relations and actually call them, incest.
Call them what?
Incest.
Oh.
The Old Testament has a broad definition for incest. World-renowned evolutionary biologist, Professor Robert Trivers, on Profile. Wildlife Adventures of an Evolutionary Biologist. This is a world-renowned man who studied at Harvard, taught at Harvard, and has taught at Rutgers. But a lot of the experiences here are about Jamaica, being locked up in Kingston, experiences with various people. He studied lizards, species of insects in Jamaica, has been coming here for decades now. And he's the winner of the Crawford Prize, which is the Nobel Prize equivalent in biosciences. Edward Q. Wilson, who is the founder of what is called sociobiology, described him, The Guardian says, described him as one of the most influential and consistently correct theoretical evolutionary biologists of our time. And the great Harvard professor and scientist Steven Pinker has said that he is one of the great leaders of thought for in the entire Western thought. Now, that is quite an accolade. When you look back at your achievements, Prof, what are your thoughts? When you look back at your extraordinary career, your remarkable contribution to science, what are your reflections?
I don't know what to say. I don't look back and have any particular reflections.
We have worked hard. What has
help me
accounted
God.
for these achievements, you would say, generally?
I don't spend a lot of time wondering what accounts for my work. I also do not spend a lot of time following up ideas. So, for example, you mentioned reciprocal altruism,
Yeah.
but I've only written 30 years later one reciprocal altruism 30 years ago chapter because I went to a conference and they asked me to talk about it.
Yes.
Otherwise, I write a paper and other people
Follow up.
Yes.
But you are the original thinker, yeah.
Well, I wrote the paper for a general theory for the evolution of sex differences in all species. So we can explain male traits in this group, female traits in that group, why they differ this way and that way. Now, that paper alone is cited over 11,000 times in the scientific literature.
11,000.
Yes, that means there are 11,000 articles that say see Trivers 72. I've never written on the topic again, but I've got 11,000 people out there busy
Amazing.
keeping the argument running.
Yes, yes. An amazing productivity. And you have this interesting theory backed up by a scientific study that some of the most homophobic men are latently homosexual.
Yes, and that's not a theory.
You have proven that in the lab.
Well, yes, there's two very good lab studies. If anybody wants to see it, they can go online to TEDx.
I've seen it. TEDx talk.
TEDx in Kingston. It was at UWI. And at the end of it, I described this very interesting study where they got A1 heterosexual men in Georgia. A1 heterosexual man has never had a homosexual experience, never had a homosexual fantasy, and has never had a homosexual thought, or so he says.
Yes.
Then you divide them into those that are rotted about homosexuals versus those that are relaxed.
Yes.
Okay, and you do this by a little questionnaire. Fine.
Yes.
Now comes the fun part. You show them dirty movies, movies of a man and a woman making love. The whatever the organ is you're allowed to call grows admirably in both groups.
Yes.
Can't tell them apart.
Yes.
Now you show them a movie of two women making love, and it starts to climb at the same rate, but then it levels out compared to a man and a woman. No difference between the two groups. Now comes the interesting one. Now they watch two men get it on, and the men that are relaxed about homosexuals show a small and statistically insignificant arousal. In other words, they're not aroused.
Yes.
Now, the ones that are rotted, guys that are rotted over it,
what
until their organ size is 2/3 as big as it is to watching two women.
This is a fact. Yeah.
This is a well-published fact.
Yes.
Now, if you ask the men in all 6 conditions to say how aroused they were and how big did they get, they are always correct on 5 of the 6 situations. The only one that's incorrect are the ones that are getting aroused to the homosexual material and who are very hostile to homosexuals.
Very revealing study.
Yes, now there's a separate study that I'm not going to bore you
Yes,
with, but
because we're
just to
out of
point
time.
out,
Yes.
he uses a completely different methodology of showing things to the brain at less than 1/3 of a second, so it doesn't hit your conscious brain, but it registers in your unconscious, which you can measure, and you can show the same bias there.
So that is.
So there's no question about it. And
So all these Jamaican homophobic men, will probably, if we check it out, they have.
well, sometimes when I read a preacher that's gone crazy or a politician, I say, hey, brother, watch it. You're outing yourself.
Robert Trivers, he's always controversial. Married to Jamaican wives, I've had several Jamaican women, loves Jamaica. Doing some on research leave now from Rutgers University. This is his book, Wildlife. Get it. It is going to be available in Jamaica very shortly. Next week, I'll be back. Until then, Ian Bourne wishing you a very pleasant and a very productive week.